Hey everyone, welcome to the Game Dev 101 podcast. I'm your host Glenn, and today I am joined by the co-founders of Red Hook Studios and the creators of the Darkest Dungeon franchise, Chris Bourassa and Tyler Sigman. Thank you so much for joining me today, Chris and Tyler. Now,
Thanks for having us. Yeah. Now we all talk at the same time.
Yeah. Now, I've covered the development of the original Darkest Dungeon on my channel already, so today I'd like to talk about Darkest Dungeon 2 and how it was made. But before we get into that, I'd like to put the transition from the original to the sequel in the proper context, as well as your individual roles at the company. Chris, your role in the credits of both games is listed as a director, and Tyler, you're listed as a designer. But what exactly does that entail on a day-to-day basis for you both?
When you have a small company, even a mid-sized company, and you are like Tyler and I, and you're very involved in making the actual, like the craft of making the game, the titles kind of become absurd. We both do a lot of different jobs. And historically, when the company started, we did every job. So it's been a slow, delegation from there. But it's kind of funny to read the credits because it doesn't really tell the story of what's happening in the studio day to day.
Yeah, and also I think what you said there is not usually how we presented. I mean, we'll often use the title co-founders, but we co-manage the studio, have since the beginning. But we've never been much for the president or CEO type titles, especially when you start out with a company of two people. It seems a little silly. But Chris is, I'll sing some of Chris's praises. Like, in addition to us kind of like co-managing the company, like Chris is the art director, he's the creative director, narrative director. And then I'm not nearly so multi-versatile. I'm the design director. So I kind of focus on the game design, but the reality is there's so much that we share together. But there are some things that, there is no sharing. I cannot draw. Thank God Chris can, that sort of thing. But
Okay. And Chris, on other podcasts and interviews, you have called Tyler your work wife and vice versa. When the two of you started working together, what made that creative partnership really click?
I think the work wife thing is kind of funny because it's like almost painfully true in a way. Like, I've been married to my actual wife for like over 20 years, and there's a lot of analogs. Tyler and I met, and there was good chemistry, and we had shared interests, and we went out and did some activities together and found that we got along, and then our life goals and priorities aligned. And then the first thing we did when we started Red Hook was like basically sign a prenup about how the ownership and structure of the company was going to work at a really high level. And that was actually a really, I always recommend people who are entering into business partnerships to do that like day zero when there is no value in the company and you've created nothing, right? Because there's nothing to be precious about or be sensitive in your ego about. So, and we've gone through phases in our like work marriage, like we're like really, really close. And then, everything is a little bit more elastic when we get into production. Tyler's kind of doing his thing. I'm doing my thing. But it kind of ebbs and flows. So I think it's embarrassingly accurate.
And Tyler, how do you look at the partnership?
Yeah, it's funny because we've used that quip before, the sort of work marriage, and it does describe functionally how things work, because you have a relationship, you do a lot of great things together and get to share these really high moments together, but you also have conflict and sometimes disagreements. But similar to, I guess, like a marriage, when you have a disagreement, the last option that you want to look at is like splitting up, So what that forces you to do is like really work through a lot of things, like if you just start dating someone or whatever, and you're not that invested and then you run into problems right away, you're like, well, that's not a good idea. I'm out. But when you've started this company together, and then gone on to have some success together, it's kind of like you really have to roll with the changes, and you have to kind of keep your relationship up. And we've talked about it on other interviews, I guess, but we have date nights where, we'll actually go out and have a nice dinner together. And
oh my God, the more we talk about it,
invariably we'll end up talking about a lot of work. But there's a difference between kind of having sometimes conversations in the middle of a workday while your 30 employees are roaming around, and then doing it at, over dinner and a glass of wine together. It really does make a difference. And I think that's, so those are where some of the parallels are. But one thing I kind of wanted to say is, like, aside from the functionality of how things work is, the other piece of that analogy is that having a good marriage is really great, having a good partner. And I think we both hopefully feel pretty lucky that, we became business partners, and that we're still business partners after 13 years of running Red Hook. So, there's a lot of joy in that, aside from just the, I guess the day to day of, like, how do you manage it?
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Now I'd like to talk about Darkest Dungeons, the original, the success of it. Because I'm wondering, like, what did that success change inside Red Hook that players probably couldn't see from the outside?
I think, not to talk around the question, but like when we started Darkest Dungeon 2, we sat down, just Tyler and I, and we're like, we don't want to make the same game again. We know we could, but neither one of us had any interest in just literally trying to paint by numbers the exact same structure. It didn't feel like an adventure. It didn't feel like creatively, exciting to us in that way. I made the assumption mistakenly that the second game would be easier because, we had some notoriety, we had some money in the bank, and we could afford to bring on people to help, and it wouldn't be like a big, huge, like impossible laundry list of tasks. What changed that I don't think people see is that as the company grows, the logistics and support structures around the effort of making the video game also have to grow, and they have to surge. Like, you can get by with almost nothing with 5 people in terms of IT, infrastructure, HR. Like, you don't need any of those things. You're just 5 guys in a clubhouse trying to bang out something cool. When you go, okay, we're going to grow to like 25. Well, now you're hiring people who, fair for them, but they're not true believers. They're not, in for a penny, in for a pound kind of people. These are, extremely talented, passionate game developers who are looking for a job, and we are offering them a job. So suddenly the expectation and the relationship slowly begins to change. It's not an overnight thing. And I think it was about halfway through DD2, and I realized this is much harder than DD1 because of all of the extra scaffolding that has to be built around a company to facilitate its growth. The upside is we're capable of developing more scope, more like a higher ceiling of quality, and like you can see the jump from 1 to 2. And I love 1, and hand-drawn stuff. It was a dream come true to do that. But like, we really tried to elevate just even the presentation on 2 to like an astronomical degree. So the staff enables you to kind of dream a little bit bigger, but it requires maintenance, running a bigger operation. And I think that I totally, just speaking for myself, I didn't see that, when we first sat down and said, let's make something different. Let's try this. Let's, add some people. I didn't process what that would mean in terms of all the jobs I don't want to do. I want to make video games. I don't actually want to like resolve workplace differences, navigate, time off calendars, track sick days. Like, I don't want to do any of those things. And that stuff does wax a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, all those things become real. And kind of, I mentioned earlier that Chris and I co-managed, but we kind of do different things. Like, Chris does a bit more of kind of the team leadership and the in-person stuff, and kind of I want to say the soft skills side. And then traditionally I was, kind of doing more coordination with lawyers, accountants, like operations and stuff like that. And the thing is both of those kind of areas increase dramatically when you grow a little bit. And it's funny because we didn't grow a ton, but proportionally we grew. Like DD1 was made by, call it 5 to 10 people, and then DD2 was made with kind of a peak team size of around 25. And, we've always been pretty conscious of not wanting to grow for growth's sake. We grew because there was a game we wanted to make that required more people. Going from 2D to 3D, you just need more people. You need more artists. You need, it took us a while, even though we were, kind of one thing is, even though we were really successful and we had plenty of money in the bank, we were really cautious about overhiring. And one of the areas that I think we probably could have gotten ourselves help sooner in was in management. And we've since now gotten a little bit more help there. We have someone who's helping us with day-to-day operations. We have other people that are kind of doing, and it's kind of weird to look back and go, how did we do this before? Like, how did the two of us, in addition to making the game, with the help of the rest of the team, do all the company management? Because now that we've delegated certain things that we don't want to do, it's almost inconceivable to think of taking those things back in addition to the normal workload that we have.
Yeah. And you're also not working with a publisher. So you're doing all the communication yourself, I imagine. And that's even more work.
Yeah, you're right. It's when I think back to DD1, I actually don't know how we did all of that.
Yeah,
but we did, and it's better. I would say we're at our best incarnation of the company in terms of like efficacy and ability to develop. We're probably in the best balanced spot we've ever been in. There's no substituting like the DD1 early days in the sense of like wonderment and discovery and all of that came along with making that game. But 2 was really hard to make for that reason, because we were in this like liminal space between being a clubhouse and being a company in a weird way. We're always a company on paper. The taxes, everything was paid. No one needs to worry about that. But like just psychologically, we were sort of like kind of like we'd left our childhood behind, but we weren't like adults yet. Like DD2 is kind of like an adolescent phase. I feel like maybe is a way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I'm wondering when the original Darkest Dungeon was done and like all the DLC was finished, was there a period afterwards where you had to recover like creatively or emotionally? Because it sounds like it was a lot of work.
Yeah, there's kind of, it's funny. I don't know. Either of us can talk on this, but yeah, it was very draining, but really exciting at the same time. And I think when you're running a company, et cetera, it's hard to find that time. Chris never really took that time. I took a small amount of time because, I don't even know if it was so much being drained by DD, but I just had a couple personal events that happened in short order. Like very like 6 weeks after DD1 came out, my father passed away kind of unexpectedly. And then, we were in early access for a while, and then we started doing DLCs. And then somewhere in there, my brother passed away. And so there was a point for me where I kind of just had to go to Chris and say, hey, like, I'm just, I'm running on fumes here. And so I kind of like tailed back for about 2 or 3 months. I worked only like maybe a quarter of the time. And that was really helpful for me at the time. But it was, I'm sure there was burnout from the work too, but it felt like that plus the personal stuff is what was challenging. I think Chris, I don't know, you seemed like you were still pretty on adrenaline at the time, maybe, and so Chris really still kept going, but I think he kind of hit his wall later, maybe.
Yeah, I think I hit mine. Yeah, like the mid or 60% of the way through DD2. I was like, this is too much. But I couldn't take a break then because we're in 60% of the way through making the game. So I didn't time my meltdown properly. But sometimes there's just a price to be paid for trying shit and
Mm.
pushing yourself, right? It's not comfortable. If it was comfortable and easy, then everyone would do it. So I tend to like romanticize picking yourself up and doing hard work, maybe a little too much, but I probably should have taken a break before we started.
But you mentioned something, Glenn, about us doing the communication, and maybe I can tie that together here, which is we've always really enjoyed being the mouthpieces of our own product. Not just Chris and I personally, but I mean, meaning that we try to control the marketing of our own game. We publish our own game, I guess, to your point. And that has so many great parts about it. We feel like we know the game better than, an agency would or whatever, but it does come with the cost of like, you're right there, like reading. I mean, we read our subreddit religiously. There's many times that I crack my knuckles and want to write a response to something and then remember that there's nothing to be gained from, responding in a certain way. And then there's, of course, many times that you read something and it really makes your day. But I do think that it's a challenge in this day and age because of how close you are to the community. Sometimes that's great and sometimes it's not great because you can't you can't maintain a healthy separation. And that does take its toll on that other stuff we were saying on kind of the burnout. When you're having a tired day or just not feeling great or whatever, and then you read some post just flaming the entire existence of the game, you're just sometimes you can laugh it off and sometimes it hits, so it's tough to manage that. Like if you were Ridley Scott making your next movie, you don't want to be sitting there thinking of like, I hope people will like this camera angle. I hope people will like how we're framing this shot. I hope people. No, you got to just actually trust in the creative process and try to do your best work and not worry about exactly how the audience will perceive that moment. And so I think Chris and I both try to do that. We read a lot. We're in touch with a lot, but we also purposefully create some separation where we can. To be like, yep, I see some people don't like that, but we wanted to do it that way, so that's the way it is,
Before you started making Darkest Dungeon 2, I'm wondering, was there ever, was creating a new IP ever on the table, or did you always know that the sequel was going to be the next big project?
I think we both agreed that there was, I guess, two vectors, but I want to be clear that one of them was much more important to both of us, which was we were still passionate and creatively like engaged. Time off notwithstanding, the stresses of running a company notwithstanding, we really believed and were excited by our IP and our universe. There is also the very real business consideration of, we have a name that, some people would recognize when we bring something new to market. So like, it's very hard to create a new IP. It's very hard to get that IP in front of people. And then it's almost a total crapshoot as to whether or not they even respond to the thing that you made. So having ticked all three of those boxes, there's a strong case to be made for like continuing to make Darkest Dungeon. But that's one of the reasons why we changed up the formula so much on 2 is because, look, we love this space. We just don't want to do the same work again.
Right.
But there was never really a discussion like, hey, let's make like any other kind of game that isn't Darkest Dungeon. I think for a little while we had talked about doing like a sci-fi kind of version of it. And we had this idea for like, instead of a stagecoach, you were kind of like a tank crew. But and then I was like, oh yeah, and we could reinterpret all these characters to be like sci-fi versions of themselves. Then I'm like, or why? Like, why? Maybe they're just really cool as they are. And then we felt like we had a lot to say about our cast of heroes, and thought it would be really exciting to make the heroes the focus for the sequel instead of the enemy bosses and stuff. So no, it was always going to be Darkest Dungeon.
Was it? Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I feel like we've had discussions where we're interested in the idea of creating a second IP, but nothing was really, I don't know, nothing was burning inside of us. At least my recollection is kind of like, we're like, yeah, we should do that. That would be cool too. But we just were excited about doing more with DD, and it was a genuine excitement, which is a mandatory thing for Chris and I, because even though there was a commercial advantage, say to, or a perceived one to making a sequel, we had to be excited about it. And that's exactly what happened. The idea of a journey, like I can just talk for myself. Like what really got me excited about DD2 was kind of two things: the idea of a journey of getting out of the hamlet and actually going, seeing more of the world, and then also the characters. I think like the characters were already really interesting, but the actual lore of the characters was something that, you know, we never really covered in DD1. And then Chris, you know, made these one sheet comics that we kind of started releasing, maybe even while DD1, you know, I forget when those started, but that was really fun to like see the backstory of the characters in a one-page comic. And so then we put it together and said, well, what if like that became part of 2, where we actually play out their backstories. So between the idea of a journey and then getting more time with the characters, you know, because DD1 kind of teaches you the characters are expendable and almost meaningless, you know, like whatever, just throw another highwayman at the you know, at the enemies, and if he dies, he dies. Of course, you get attached to them too, but my point being, it sort of pushes you towards almost not caring. Whereas 2, I feel like we were taking a totally different approach, which is, no, each hero matters, and they're flawed, and they're, you know, they have these horrific, tragic stories, but that's who you have to save the world, and that just sounded really exciting to me. And so that made me like excited about spending a few more years making Darkest Dungeon stuff when we had already just spent a few years making Darkest Dungeon stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Before we go deeper into the development of Darkest Dungeon 2, I'd like to use the divided reaction of the player base as a starting point. To me, at least, it seemed like there was a real like split opinion, where there were players who loved that it had become a more traditional run-based roguelike experience. Plenty of people even preferred that over the original, like myself included. However, other players seemed frustrated precisely because it moved away from what they loved about the first game. When you look back at that reaction now, how do you interpret that divide? Did it feel like a sign that the game was misunderstood, or more like the unavoidable consequence of making a sequel that deliberately took a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about this very thing. I wouldn't even say when we look back, like you can just look on the Reddit today and there's still people arguing about why DD2 sucks or why they like it better than 1. Our initial, all I can talk about is what we thought. Okay. Like, cause you don't have like perfect information. So in the moment we're like, look, why would we make a game whose sole existence is built to eclipse the game people already like? Why would we set out to make a sequel that tries to do better in every category than the original game and basically make our original release obsolete? Like, that seems insane. So let's think of a way of taking things that we think are cool and packaging them up and creating an analogous type of a game, but one that can sit beside its older brother and just offer a different experience or a different view into the IP slightly. That was sort of where we started from. And we're like high-fiving liberal amounts of high fives because we're like, we've cracked the code. You know, this way no one has to pick a favorite. So fast forward like 5, 6, 7 years, and you know, people are still arguing about which one's their favorite. So we were, I guess, wrong in how we oriented ourselves initially. I think there's a couple things that are at play. When we launched Darkest Dungeon 1, there were zero expectations. And it was a polished game that did a few things that were quite fresh, I think, at the time. And there was a lull in the release calendar. And there was a prevailing opinion that early access as a mechanism for delivering games was kind of dead because there'd been a couple of high-profile failures. And we started showing up, you know, every 6-8 weeks with a branded kind of cool patch release update. We were having fun making it. I think that kind of came through. And it engendered a lot of goodwill. When we released 2, our mistaken assumptions were, okay, we're going to release, another game. It's going to be rough, the same way DD1 was rough. It's going to have a similar amount of scope, the same way, we had some, we graphed out they're roughly equivalent in terms of their content. But the tolerance for early access, or the colloquial understanding of what early access was, I believe had changed in the intervening years to being like an expectation that it's actually just kind of like live service. So if you're not coming out extremely polished with a roadmap and then hitting that roadmap, like the ground had kind of changed a little bit. And so DD2 was just as underbaked as DD1 when it kind of came straight out of the oven. Some people responded to that. Some people were very attached to certain features of the game Darkest Dungeon, as opposed to the universe, and responded that way. They're like, I like an XCOM like. Darkest Dungeon just happens to be my favorite XCOM like, as opposed to like I like, you know, the tone, the mood, the setting, the characters, that kind of thing. So I guess in the end of the day, I believe it's just a natural consequence of sequeling. There's expectations. People are bringing what they loved most about the first one and then looking at the second one through that lens. And the longer the second one has existed, we've seen sort of a general like shift in the population of our like fan groups, you know, Discord or Reddit, for example, to being a little bit more equal in terms of what people prefer. Yeah. But 2 had an uphill slog for sure. And part of that might be that, I don't know, we've read all the critiques. It's like there's too many systems. It's too hard to grok. The runs are too long. The runs are too short. And I think it's just tough when you get in the weeds trying to like the stagecoach. I'm the stagecoach guy. I'm like, if it's a road trip, it's going to be in a stagecoach, and we got to be behind the stagecoach so you see the horizon and blah, blah, blah. So like, I accept a full stagecoach responsibility. I think people think it's a game where you have to hit the blocks, but then, you know, whatever.
It was meant to be analogous to walking through a hallway.
Walking in a dungeon. I'm like, well, you walk the same amount of time in the dungeon. Anyway, it doesn't really matter what we thought, because what happened is what happened. But I think there are things that players didn't like, or expectations that they carried over from the first one, that prevented some people from maybe seeing the game as just what it is, which is a game. And it offers a different experience. And I think what I've seen is that when people engage with it from that perspective, they find a lot of the fun in DD2. But it's not good. DD1 was not a game for everybody. And we said that probably 100,000 times when we were making it. And DD2 is not a game for everybody. But I would rather make a game that I want to make than try to chase and unite all fan expectations into a single creation, because I think that's an impossible task. And I think what you'll get at the end of it is something that doesn't even make sense conceptually.
Yeah, I mean, we took, Glenn, your question was interesting because the second part, I think you said, is real, where like we did depart from the exact formula of DD1. And I don't know, you look back to DD1, it was a risky game to make, like when we were first pitching it to people, we're like, okay, it's an RPG, it's a dungeon crawler, but it's about the psychological stress of your adventurers. And, a lot of people are like, oh, okay. And then you say, so imagine they get back, they're all stressed out. You can send them to the bar to drink. You can send them to church to pray. Then people start perking up, whatever. But it's a weird concept, right? So, and we took a lot of risks with it. And so our development style is like, there's some amount of risk built in. And I guess yeah, I admit also, I did not think that changing the formula was that big of a risk because, we're keeping the combat, which in fact, we improved the combat. And I think even most DD2 detractors would admit that the combat is generally superior. But, I was like, no, it's the same. You have the same heroes. You're having the same combat.
Yes.
Instead of the hallways, it's a node map because intentionally we were creating a roguelite, a true roguelite, a run-based roguelite. And the interesting thing there is I actually thought we would appeal to a lot more people, perhaps, not that our goal is just like enlarge the audience, but you want your game to be successful. But, DD1 had some kind of pretty strong, I want to say flaws, which is all, of course, in the eye of like what you want, but there was a lot of grind. I felt like I encountered many people anecdotally that are like, oh, I've heard about the game. I've wanted to try it, but I hear it's so hard. And it also requires so much time. And so we were kind of excited about recrafting around kind of a run-based loop, because it just sounded cool. Like, hey, you put this party together and you go as far as you can until you die. That's such a great loop in general for a lot of games. And then pairing it with this road trip motif and being able to get equipment for the coach, and then all these things. And so we were pretty jazzed. And I think just maybe we all have our blind spots, but I did not realize how divisive it would be to change up the formula. But I don't know if we knew that like neither of us wanted to make DD 1.5. That's what kind of everyone refers to, like the people that really are unhappy with DD2 often, they want DD 1.5. They want, it's another Hamlet or a bigger Hamlet or a different, Hamlet, I don't know, or the Hamlet but remastered, which is like, okay, well, Chris drew everything in game one and I think it's awesome, and it still is awesome and it still holds up. Again, to his point, why would we want to just redo that? But the point is you do take risks in development, and I think it's been hard, definitely for us, because we put even more work into DD2 than DD1. It was a longer development cycle. We've, I think, I don't know, like I think maybe bits of DD2 were a bit more underbaked at early access launch than DD1, but not because we realized it. We put the same amount of effort in, but we really quickly, like we ended up spending 18 months in early access on DD2, whereas DD1 we were 11 months. So we took the time needed to like hit all the things that we felt needed to be, improved. And that was purely because of how much we care about the game. Like we were only on the Epic Game Store at the time, and it would have been very good financially for us to get to Steam as fast as possible. But we didn't. We took the time that we felt the game needed to really make it, in our eyes, a 1.0 before we came to Steam. And that's exactly what we did. So, but yeah, it's been a journey. Like it's been an arduous trip. Darkest Dungeon 1 was like really a lot of hard work and really intense, but DD2 has been longer and in some ways tougher problems to solve. For all the reasons I guess that we've hit, but
I would say this though, if we could go back and be sitting down knowing everything that we know, I would just be like, okay, how do we make this stagecoach thing work even better? Like, how do we make the road trip thing work even better? I wouldn't be like, wow, that whole thing was misguided or, anything like that. I would not go back and go, you know what, we should just do DD 1.5. Like that's not, that's never really entered my mind. I'm really proud of DD2 actually.
Yeah, it's actually, we truly believe it's a good game, and not just because we made it. We're deeply familiar with our own, missteps in any game that we made, including games before Darkest Dungeon. Chris mentioned it, but it's been really interesting to see the sentiment. Like, yeah, there's posts every week saying like, which one is better? Or I've heard bad things about DD2. Is it? And there's a lot of people who prefer it. And that's really been wonderful to see too, because I think the bummer for us is just like, oh man, we tried to deliver two games in the same universe that kind of do, have a different lens into the world. Can't you like them both? Or do we have to kind of like don this, or, hold the battle standard of one and tear down the other? And not that everybody's doing that, but there are people out there who seem to exist solely to jump in the conversations and talk about what they hate. But it's been hard.
When I saw Darkest Dungeon 2 for the first time, I was excited because it was so different. When I'm playing a game, the main thing I'm looking for is experiencing something that I've never experienced before, like playing something I've never played before. So I always think it's more interesting when a sequel pivots to something else, something new. Because like you said, like you don't want to just make a better Darkest Dungeon, because that would eclipse the original, and then you have no reason to play the original anymore. So yeah, like I thought it was far more interesting what you did with Darkest Dungeon 2. And like I said, I also prefer more traditional roguelike experiences. So yeah, to me, that was perfect.
It kind of shows that one game can't be everything. And we often muse about kind of just like in a world where DD1 didn't exist, if we had dropped DD2, like, would it have gotten a fairer shake? This is not us, like, I don't know, crying foul. It's just more like, I think it's our own fault, right? We made a good first game, and people like, yeah, more of that. But I think we felt we were giving more of that, and just some people feel like, oh no, I meant specifically the hallways or whatever it is. And that's not to. I want to be clear. We love DD1. I think it's a really cool loop. I think the whole coming back, that sort of XCOM like structure, but specifically with kind of more stuff. Like, you come back to town and this guy's an alcoholic and this one is like a zealot. Like that was a really neat loop. And it's not like I think the DD2 loop is superior. I think they're just different. And it was fun to make two different games.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As hard as it was, there's a lot of like really exceptional moments and great work that went into two. And I think like studio wise, it represents a lot of high water marks for us. Like even just the bosses, like the Leviathan, like, you see the giant hand and then the head bursts out of the water. Like the final boss on 2 is just like orders of magnitude crazier than anything we did in 1. So there's like, there were like a lot of high points around. I feel like we're sort of creating this impression that like, it was a slog and we were unhappy because we kind of started there. But I was trying to be candid about that stuff because making games is not easy. So I want to be like open about like the challenges, but like, don't for a second, anyone who hears this shouldn't think for a second there wasn't like, protracted periods of like exuberance and excitement and, on the team and everyone trying to one up each other to make the work better and better and better. And big aha moments. Like, it was just, it was very difficult in different ways because of the studio growth, which is sort of where we started the whole conversation.
Yeah. But like the side of the growth is we got to bring in all these people and we've done a really good job of hiring talented people. And we do, we try to turn them loose as much as we can. I mean, we hold a pretty iron hand in terms of the direction, but once it's brought down to like, here, this is what we need this thing, people shine. And it's been really cool. Like, I think to see, the quality of the work, it's like we have gone to iterate on DD1, like, the trinkets in DD2 are like way more interesting because we have the experience of having made these trinkets in DD1 and then there's new systems in DD2. And I feel like, so for example, bringing, the designers that are working on that got to do really cool stuff. The artists that are like doing everything from the environments to the in-battle stuff. Like, it was great to have a bigger team full of really talented people to do these amazing things. And I think some of those high moments, like Chris is saying, I mean, I still love the shrine, like the backstory combats. I know some of them are real gimmicky and some of them are like, but narratively, I just think they're really cool. Like, it's so fun, like the first Plague Doctor one where you're like arguing with your professor in class using the DD turn-based combat system. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of things I think we're still quite proud of. And one of the things I'm proud of is the areas that we did find were lacking or were like not as polished. We gutted whole systems if we had to, or revised them or whatever. And I think that was some of our finest work, to be like, okay, we got to look at this with our own objective eyes and say, that part is not working. That's not good enough. What can we do to improve that? And, I think there was more of that in DD2. But that's something I like I said, I think we take pride in that hard work because it's easy to just go, I don't know, I'm just going to forget about it, but I think every flaw that we saw, we tried to address, and the game's I think the game's in great shape. We're still making stuff for it. So like, we put out the whole free stuff, which, I'm sure you'll probably get to, but like, we did Kingdoms mode, we did other stuff because we wanted to,
so much. We're terrible businessmen.
To talk more about the excitement of making the sequel, what was the original spark for it? Like, was it a meeting, a conversation, something you saw online? Because I'm wondering just how you got to something so different, I guess.
I mentioned it earlier, but it really was just Tyler and I sitting down and going like, I don't want to make the same game again. We can't do that. Yeah, I know. our combat's really good though, really love our characters. Yeah, I know. And then I can't remember where it came from, but just the idea of a road trip, having taken a road trip with children, I'm like, definitely got excited about, instead of staying in one spot for a sequel, wouldn't it make sense to upend it, like to go on a journey, right? And then I can't remember exactly, who said what and when, but out of that discussion between the two of us, this idea of going on a, like having a vital destination and trying to endure the journey there. And then this sort of twist of like, yeah, you could be driving and then they're bickering and fighting, and this sort of trope of like, I'll turn this car around.
We saw Fury. Actually,
Fury was a big one. That's right. Yeah.
The tank movie with Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
That I want to say that was like 2015-ish or 16. So we were already making DD1 at that point. But I think it came back to us later because it was, like in the same way, like certain movies and other media inspired DD1. We've talked about Aliens or Band of Brothers or whatever. I think Fury ended up planting a seed. I'm not saying it was fully responsible, but it was kind of an interesting concept of like these 4 or 5 people in a tank together, are at each other's throats, but also have to function together and ultimately have this like, quote, noble quest that they have to achieve. And that seemed really in line with Darkest Dungeon, right? Because Darkest Dungeon's always been about flawed characters. And we're like, oh man, put them in a road trip together. And it's kind of the same thing. Like, you don't want to just drop this, that two of the people are arguing. Well, you still need them because that guy, does this role and this person does this role. And so that creates a lot of interesting narrative ground in the same way that I think coming back from a dungeon and, blowing off steam in town creates all these interesting story hooks. Being stuck in a stagecoach together sounded like some really fertile ground for kind of narrative, like emergent narrative.
Yeah. And when you were expanding like the road trip idea, what still felt essential from the first game and had to survive in the sequel?
Tyler mentioned combat. We felt like that was vital. Things like quirks and stress, imperfections in your heroes as a theme, or however it's mechanically expressed. But for us, it's quirks and stress. That's absolutely vital. The art style, the tone, that's vital. We challenged ourselves to think about, okay, like what is a Darkest Dungeon kart racing game? What's a Darkest Dungeon city builder? Like, just to help weed out what is the IP and what is the video game.
Right.
What does it mean to be in the Darkest Dungeon world, agnostic of a particular game structure? So things like that I just mentioned were really important. Builds, being able to tweak and tinker with your hero, and synergies, which are kind of the mirror image of like the stress and the chirping at each other, is like on the other side, how do we empower players to get in and pair items or trinkets with quirks, with skill selection in interesting ways that kind of make them feel really smart and get them ahead of the power curve, at least temporarily. And I think the final ingredient that's really important is playing with player agency is a vital part of what I think makes a Darkest Dungeon game. You have to make permanent, like lasting decisions with imperfect information. So you had to do that in DD1. You have to do it in DD2. I can't imagine it being a Darkest Dungeon game without some amount of, I got to play the hand I'm dealt, and I know that life sometimes has other plans. That's kind of essential to like the world that we've created, and we try to express that not only like tonally but mechanically as well. And we're both big poker fans. Tyler probably even more so than me. And so that's sort of like intelligent gambling kind of philosophy. Like I can learn the odds, I can stack them in my favor, I can make intelligent plays, but I have to be ready to pivot because sometimes even the intelligent play goes south, right? I love that kind of being on the edge. And it's a lot like running a company. You don't know, is your release window going to get screwed? Is there going to be some scandal in the community? Is one of your key staff members going to have like something happen in their lives that takes them out of the roster for a little while? these things can just happen on a dime, and we'll actually joke like, what's this week's curveball? Where is it coming from? It's rare we get through a week without something unexpected happening, and they're not always disasters. Sometimes they're lucky bounces, but the idea that leadership to some extent, which is what we've challenged you to do in both DD1 and DD2, is a lot about preparation. It's a lot about thinking on your feet when things don't go according to the plan you prepared for.
How did the run-based structure like change the way you thought about tension? Because in the original, there's always this tense atmosphere because someone from your roster that you've been building up for hours and hours might die in the next expedition. But in the more traditional roguelike experience, dying is very much part of the process. So that's kind of why I'm asking that.
Yeah, it's interesting. One part of the debate when you see kind of people talking about why they prefer DD1 or DD2 does come down to personal preference in this area, which is that for some people, that attachment you form with your level 5 or 6 hero in DD1, you've had them through many missions and they finally die, is a really exciting part of the game. And for some people, it turns them off. Obviously, we intended that to be a thing in DD1. But DD2, we thought, oh, well, there's still lots of reasons to care. And in the kind of roguelite loop, you're making progress, so your time's not wasted. But we did take a risk with, the runs are a bit longer. Like, a lot of traditional roguelites, the runs can vary. I want to say modern roguelites. They can vary like between 20, 30 minutes to, sure, some of the action ones could be 10 minutes or whatever, but to like maybe an hour at the top. But, in DD2, a run through a full length area, like a full length confession. So like kind of confessions 2 through 5, it can take 2 hours. It can take even 3 hours if you're a slow player. So we felt like that was still enough to matter, but we also didn't want you to feel like your time was wasted. When you do die, you get stuff for it. You get more upgrades and but I think that is another area that like really works well for some people. And for some people it's weird because the runs take a while, but it was kind of intentional. We felt like it's a journey. It's a road trip. You don't want to feel like we just had a 20-minute road trip, like it needs to feel a little bit more weighty, that you persevered through this region, you reach the end just in time. Everyone was almost dead. You heal, you go through another, you limp into the next end. Like we wanted it to feel a bit arduous. And so, but I will say we specifically thought, oh, for this game, it's okay if it doesn't have quite the stakes all the time that DD1 had, because that can be pretty exhausting to play. And we ultimately want people to play the games and have fun. And, so it was just a different recipe. Like the one stew was flavored with this ingredient and this stew is flavored with this. But, we felt like there were still costs to failure. And that's definitely part of Darkest Dungeon.
I think one thing that was really interesting to me that we thought would be sort of immediately understood or taken at face value by the players was that the inn is the break point. The inn is analogous to the town in DD1, really, and in terms of how it impacts your characters. That's where you do your stress treatment, your recovery, and all those things. So whether or not you're dragging a character into a box or you're dragging a box onto a character, it's essentially serves the same function. And so when people are like, the runs are too long, in my mind, I'm like, well, a DD1 run is, let's call it 15, 20 minutes. A region in DD2, once you're reasonably versed with the game, 20, 25 minutes. That's the break point. Like you're back home. And it's kind of one of the reasons why the inns, are peppered along that way, is they're meant to be this kind of familiar resting point where, if you're done playing, you can check out at the inn. Like it's great. But that people felt like they weren't complete, right? Like that a run was really only complete if you beat the boss, in that sense, or rather it just didn't translate as one-to-one as I sort of thought it might, which was interesting. But
when you replaced the long-term campaigns with individual expeditions, individual run-based expeditions, what was the hardest design problem you had to solve?
Boy, there's a lot of them, but weirdly, this is the opposite to the question you asked. One thing I like is in DD1, trinket design was really challenging because basically, if you design too good of a trinket, they can just keep that and use that trinket for every quest till the end of time. And it ended up kind of putting a lot of pressure in the design space to like not be too crazy. Whereas DD2, because you only get that trinket for that run, you know, and you have to find it again for the next run. I really thought that was cool because I could go to my trinket designer and go, hey, like get wild, get crazy, get weird. You know, because I think one of the funnest parts about roguelites is like that being able to get a wombo combo, you know, being able to find something really cool or like, you know, or two things or three things that stack together that basically are OP. But again, you have to find them, you have to put them together, and you can't rely on, you know, that. So I don't know, that first thing came to mind, which I recognize is not the question you asked, but it's an example of kind of how the design space does differ between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think hard parts, like, I guess, I want to think about that a little more, but, you know, there's a shared sense of story in the first one, right? Because you build up your relationship with these heroes. You know, that's the hero that, you know, helped me beat Wilbur and the swine, you know, oh, this is the hero that like survived this unlikely thing. And then that affects, you know, that you build your own story. Whereas, you know, here, obviously the stories are more like individually self-contained. And so I guess design wise, it's like you still have to figure out reasons for people to care about each individual run. I don't know. I mean, there was plenty of challenges. I guess not one in particular is popping to mind at the moment, but I'll think about it for a second.
That's okay. That's fine. Earlier, you talked about the combat and how it's a vital part of Darkest Dungeon and how you improved it for Darkest Dungeon 2. Were there parts of Darkest Dungeon 1's combat that were sacred and then parts that you wanted to maybe get rid of?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the sacred part was the rank positioning and the idea that, well, obviously at least for making DD2, the turn-based aspect we felt was still really strong. The rank-based positioning and the skills, you know, the core skill system where you're like, you need to be in ranks 3 or 4 and you can only hit rank 1. Like, it's just such a cool, fun thing. Those were sacred. But the one thing that was not sacred.
Stuff.
What's that?
Some hero identity stuff was kind of sacred.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to have a bounty hunter who doesn't do the pull move. You're not going to have a Hellion that doesn't have, you know, barbaric yup. So like some like core skills were like vital to preserve in the heroes. Sorry, Tyler.
No, that's good. But the fun, like a really fun part of being able to, you know, because when we started making 2, I mean, we could have just kept all the combat rules exactly as is, but we, you know, I purposely went through an exercise. I said, well, what would I change? What can, you know, if nothing, you know, anything's on the table, what would I change? That's where we quickly figured, okay, well, no, this part is still good. This is good. But a lot of, you know, some of the stat-based stuff I felt like had done well for DD1, but had eventually presented some challenges. So, for example, accuracy is one I talk about a lot. In DD1, you know, accuracy was a stat, and it was intentional because, you know, you miss sometimes. That was just, you know, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. You roll the 20-sided die, you miss sometimes. It was just ingrained. Like, I didn't even really think of a scenario where you don't actually miss. But what happened with DD1 is like people really, you know, they really dislike missing. Kind of the joke about XCOM, you know, where you have like 95% accuracy, you miss your shot, you feel like you got cheated, even though that there is a 1 in 20 chance, you know. But, you know, and then when you get to something like like the leper, he was always envisioned as this hard hitting character that has a low accuracy. So I think in DD1, I want to say his accuracy started out somewhere around like 2/3, so he'd miss a lot, maybe even less. I can't remember, but he hits really hard. And from kind of a math standpoint, it's a cool problem. You have a character that hits all the time but does small damage, or a character that hits half the time and does big damage. I like that that's like a thing, that even though on paper maybe their equivalent damage over 5 rounds is the same, how they distribute their damage is so different. So anyway, what happened over the course of DD1 is gradually we tuned accuracy up and up and up to where kind of the version of the game now is most accuracies are pretty high. Like you miss rarely, and people really hate missing. So with DD2, I was like, that's not a satisfying part of the game. And I had been, I'm not a collectible card game maniac, but, I can appreciate the really cool design of a lot of CCGs. You look at something like Hearthstone, or even going back to Magic, right? You attack with your creature, it hits. What I like about, say, something like those games, like Hearthstone is all the mechanics are really clear. Like, oh, death rattle, this happens when he dies. Taunt, you have to attack that person, right? There's not a lot of chance. It's not like taunt 70% of the time he needs attacked first. So with DD2, I kind of was like, how do I take some of those learnings and tighten up? DD is always going to have some RNG. That's a part of what we like. Yeah. But hitting is an example, I guess, to tie the story up. Accuracy went away. You know what? All heroes hit unless the enemy has dodge or unless you're blinded. And I thought that was a more successful way of like expressing that sort of tactical space, is like we can still have a leper who misses a lot because some of his skills blind himself. And that means, and you can look and say, oh shoot, I know he has a chance of missing this next hit. Is there, can I apply something to him? Can I put the milk soaked rags on his eyes or whatever? And so we tried to just tighten up that. And that's what gave birth to what's known as the token system, which is just like, instead of having to look at the character sheet and be like, oh, okay, there's a 32% chance of this happening, you just see the token. Oh, he's blinded. That's a 50-50. And we tried to keep all the numbers pretty like coarse. Sorry for the long-winded version of that.
No, that's fine. Is that also how like the token system came about? Like your knowledge from trading card games, and were you maybe inspired by that?
Yeah, definitely inspired. Like I'm not even I don't even play them that much, but I sample them and I can appreciate the mechanics. And so yes, I liked that for the player to visually see and understand exactly what can transpire. And then we work, Chris and I had to work together to arrive at something that visually was okay. And I think both of us were happy with that change because, again, rather than having to look at like a bunch of stats, I mean, there still are some stats in the game, but the tokens were meant to be a visual representation of, mechanics that you understand. And I play a ton of board games, so it also felt very board gamey. Yeah. And I think
the trick that you pulled off really nicely, Tyler, with that whole system was that we improved communication without sacrificing like tactical depth. Mm-hmm. So instead of mousing over like a buff icon and seeing like a tooltip that's like 11 lines long and then thinking to yourself like, okay, how do I put all this together? We did a lot of that work for you. We made things chunkier, or Tyler did in this case, but without kind of shrinking the tactical play space, the strategic range of options. Actually, in a lot of cases, I think even enhance them because there's an answer to every problem. So your leper skill blinds you. Do you have this item? Should you use this item now, or should you wait for it later? Could you use another hero skill to de-blind him so that you can, all of these things kind of open up. Whereas before, if it was just a roll of the dice and a whiff, there isn't really much player-based kind of decision-making that can happen. So I think it was a really strong and well-executed change.
I'd like to talk a bit more about the art direction as well and the move to 3D. Chris, you mentioned earlier you wanted to do more with the art style now that you had a bigger budget. But Darkest Dungeon had such a recognizable 2D style, and you were already making changes to the core gameplay. So I am like wondering why you decided to move from 2D to 3D and maybe alienate players not just from a gameplay perspective but also from a visual perspective.
Well, number one, I think we nailed it. I don't think anybody was actually alienated, although I recognize that was a risk. I think when you go through the sort of 3.5 years process of illustrating 95% of everything that shows up on screen, your appetite to do that again for another 5 years is greatly diminished. I'm very I had help from Brooks, who's a tremendous who learned 2D animation to animate DD1, and we had some really amazing contractors who helped with some trinket sketches and some supporting art, and we brought Trudy Castle on late in the DD1 sort of cycle to do the town event images and things like that. So there were other artistic contributors, is my point, but the vast preponderance of the art in DD1 is all me, and I'm very proud of it. It's probably like it'll probably be the greatest thing I ever do from like a single authorship standpoint. Like, look at all this work I did. I don't know that I'll come over the top with DD3 is 4 times as big and I fired everyone and I did it all myself. I don't think that's going to happen. So, coming into DD2, I'm like, I don't know that I want to draw everything in an entire game all over again, starting from zero. I don't think that we can sell people the same sprites a second time. That's kind of gross. So how many different ways can I draw the Highwayman's pose? Like when he does point blank shot, I can redraw it just for the sake of saying it's a new game. But it was very, very taxing. And the same way we didn't want to make the same game again, I didn't necessarily want the same job on that game again.
Yeah.
Plus, and more interestingly, I think, I crave growth and maturation and aspiration. And these are not just words for me. Like, could we do it in 3D? That's so much more exciting. Having done the first game and hand drawn it, I know that I could do it again if I wanted to, really. But the fascinating thing becomes, what could we accomplish if these were 3D models? Could we even sell the art style? How much crazier could the VFX be? The animations alone, think of the possibilities. So it was really kind of an aspirational move made to delight people, not again to not say, hey, DD1 sucks. I think a lot of the artwork in that game, I think I'm a little bit of a better illustrator at this point, having made that stuff. But looking back, I'm like, no, it holds up. It's kind of timeless in a way. And I love that. But what if, it's kind of just exciting. So for me, that was a great and kind of wonderful part of making DD2. We brought on a really talented character modeler that I'd worked with at a previous company named Kevin Freitas. And together with him and Trudy, we went through a bunch of proportional things. We tried bringing the sort of chibi or larger head proportions into 3D. It looked terrible. And then I'm like, well, all the marketing art I did for DD1 had more action figure kind of X-Men proportions. Why don't we try that? All that whole process of working through how to manifest the art style in 3D was extremely exciting from just a pure development nerd kind of standpoint. And it felt like we were kind of artists on the case, running an investigation down. And ultimately, I think it pays the bills. We were able to do so much more. We can change, their weapons, so we can have kind of cool cosmetics and themed stuff that way. The anticipatory animations that Yusuf built, he's our animation director, so that you can get a wind up before the shot. Create so much more personality in the heroes, and then the visual effects alone. Done mostly by Tom Francis, our VFX artist, and just are over the top. We just could not do that type of thing in the same framework. So for me, the risk of alienating a group of people, was actually just a challenge. Like, how do we not alienate a group of people? How do we do this really, really, really well? And I think, as soon as we released our first trailer, the Glimmer of Hope trailer, and we showed all the 3D models, I hand painted all those models. Like, it's not like I'm not involved. So all the ink work on those models is done by the same guy who drew the characters the first time out. Everybody like really loved that view of what they look like. And I think it was a really successful marriage of kind of art direction and the ability of the team to execute. But yeah, I I did all the concept art for every character, and then I did 90% of all the texture work, and the stuff I didn't do, I worked over. So it's like the same heart is going into representing it in 3D. It's no less work. It's just different work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what was harder than expected about like keeping the identity intact in 3D? Because it is like very impressive, like how you manage to translate it so seamlessly from 2D to 3D. But I imagine that wasn't an easy process.
No, it was a process for sure. Like I mentioned that, the proportions had to change because they just looked stupid, like lining up like 4 bobbleheads in 3D. For some reason, in 2D, your brain abstracts it, and you're like, no, he's a cool guy with a pistol and a sword. I can see it. But when it's a 3D model, that proportion, you're like, oh, it's like a meeple. It's like absurd. There was some texture stuff, like how we handle the ink work versus the colors. It was very important that you never see pixels on the black lines, or else it defeats the illusion that they're inked kind of, by hand. So the inks are actually a separate texture that's a higher resolution than the color on the characters. And because I felt strongly that if you got close enough to the characters and you start to see the stair stepping on the ink lines, it would look cheap and break down. So wherever possible, that was a really important thing. Trying to think. Lighting, we could do a lot more with lighting. There was a lot more variables to play with. And it was a process to try and figure out, okay, we can't texture the characters this level of brightness, or they'll bloom out in the lights and that kind of thing. But it was just iteration. So there was nothing like unstoppable, but they were like satisfying sort of obstacles to meet and then push through every step. But it took us like over a year to figure it out and start making assets that were like, put that in the game. And then similarly, the backgrounds and environment assets had to go through the same process. How do we make combat arenas? Well, we can't just draw every single thing. We have to drive past it. So it has to be in 3D. Yeah. And Mariel, our lead environment artist, worked with Trudy to kind of create this like texture first approach where mostly Trudy, sometimes me, would draw the side of the building, here, there, and everywhere at different sides and stuff. And then they would build the model off of the texture instead of building a model and then texturing that model, which was nice philosophically because it preserved the importance of the hand-drawn art. Like modeling existed in DD2 to serve and elevate the texture work. Much to the chagrin of the modelers, but I think the end result is a really nice marriage. So, it was great. That's one of my favorite things about DD2, actually.
Okay, cool. I'd like to move on to the narrative and the overall theme of Darkest Dungeon 2. The first Darkest Dungeon is a story about inheritance and dealing with the consequences of someone else's obsession and mistakes. So I'm curious, what narrative territory did you want the sequel to explore?
I feel like and the first one's ambition too, right? It's kind of like it starts out as his ambition, but then you realize you're executing the same boundless ambition, and you're like, oh, did I become the baddie?
Yeah,
but.
Yeah, DD1 is a bit like a nihilistic vortex, and it's kind of meant to suck you up. And then some of the lines towards the end, exactly like what Tyler said, the narrator's like, there's no difference between us. Like, you've ended up in the same spot as me. And then I love the kind of I guess there's spoilers here, but Yeah, the time loop reset where you're always arriving at the hamlet and always trying to warn yourself to turn back at the start of every campaign. So that's pretty hopeless. And that was a fun like space to explore. With GD2, I thought it would be cool to explore the concept of like kind of like hope and self redemption and failure. So the whole game, every hero has a 5-part backstory where they kind of fail or are challenged in some way. Similarly, there are 5 acts which are confronting the player character with their sort of the story of their failures. And I thought it was neat to like unpack the sort of preconditions that have to exist before you really fuck your life up. And then what it takes to actually make things right, and the fact that no one will swoop in and kind of save you. And I felt like that really married nicely with this roguelike thing where like you have to wake up and work at doing better every single day, and you're going to have setbacks, and that's the same thing. Like you die in a run, you start a new run, you set a new intention for yourself, come up short. What choice do you have but to try again the next day? So it was a fundamentally more optimistic space, and it was an interesting challenge to marry that with the sort of Lovecraftian cosmic horror influences that I think are really important in Darkest Dungeon. But ultimately, I think that it really works well, and I'm actually really proud of how the sort of the beginning, the story of DD2, and then especially like kind of the end resolution where I feel like we managed to pull off kind of a happy ending in an authentically Lovecraftian cosmic horror universe, which is like a bit of a tough sell. But I think by the time you beat DD2, you feel like you earn that ending.
And the theme, like I want to touch on a piece of that because when we were talking about like what got us excited about working on the second one, that sort of inherent darkness of DD1, where it's all almost for naught, was cool and fun. But the idea of a journey and hanging that journey on a framework of, I used the term earlier, but a noble quest, I thought was really powerful. Obviously, a lot of us, we love Lord of the Rings, grew up reading Tolkien, was excited when they made the movies. They were good. But that part of the reason that story is just so compelling is like, it's a nearly hopeless quest, but one built on really absolute clarity of purpose. There's no like, well, I guess if you're into defeating Sauron, that's cool. But, I feel like in this day and age, there's so much, it's so hard to find like one common purpose, especially now in this like very politically divided world. And I liked the pairing of like, no, we're journeying, we're riding a stagecoach across the world to dunk the ring and Mount Doom, and the only people willing to do it are these effed up absolute shells of human beings, that are the heroes. That got me really excited when Chris was kind of like sketching out the idea of the second one ultimately being more about redemption and hope. And you can achieve that, I guess, spoiler, you can achieve that redemption. Whereas in DD1, it's kind of, well, this is, I guess, a North American analogy, but it's Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown right when he goes to kick it. And here, like, we don't do that switch on you. Like you are doing this very noble thing, and it's kind of for no greater purpose than also your own. I mean, there is the whole cosmic significance, but you're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because it's going to get you awards and notoriety. In terms of like these heroes, they're just, somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to face down these monsters.
Yeah. You mentioned the backstories of the characters, so I'd like to ask a bit more about that. How did you decide how much humanity to reveal behind characters that were like previously more archetypal?
There's a couple of considerations. I really think that the Twilight Zone-y vibe of not ever quite having a full picture is important and cool. So I didn't want to literally expose everything. There is also the reality of like if I'm writing a page and a half for each chapter for each hero, that's too much work to get done. So we tried to be as like minimalist as possible. And sort of create a lot of space for kind of questions and interpretation, because I think that's really fun. It's fun to watch in the fan base, watch people try to like make connections and put things together. So there was a practical reality to how much work can we put into these things. There's the desire to kind of keep things a little bit vague. But the way I think about our cast of heroes is like they're like medieval X-Men, right? So they all have like their tragic kind of, or whatever, greater or lesser degree tragic origin story. They all have their kind of power or the thing that they do really well, better than anyone else, and then they kind of have their like iconic look. Because like low fantasy is just a bunch of sad white people in muddy armor, in a trench somewhere, right? It's not like, it doesn't pop like visually the same way. So I pulled a lot from like growing up reading superhero comics, and I tried to inject some of that DNA into our cast. And so when we came, I worked with Trudy on the origin comics and with Tyler and trying to come up with like a cool hook, a little mini horror story for each of the heroes was really fun and exciting. And I think actually it moves them away from being archetypal, but I think that's good. I think that's a natural evolution for where we want to take our cast. I think making them actual characters strengthens them and allows us to do things like give them kind of a canonical events in their lives that they carry with them kind of each time. So it was cool to do. And then trying to do those in the mechanics of the fights was really cool too.
Yeah.
And then the one that we didn't reveal anything on is the bounty hunter.
Right. Yeah.
And we still like catch flack for that.
Yeah. I refuse to catch any flack for that, because like, so think about Disney, right? They're like, they buy Star Wars and you're like, okay, no one will ever make a bounty hunter cooler than Boba Fett. And somehow they managed to do it with Mandalorian. And you're like, okay, but surely they'll never ruin Boba Fett. And they managed to do it with Book of Boba Fett. And then you're like, but surely they won't ruin the new coolest bounty hunter. And they managed to do that too. And it's like, the more you say about the mystery character, the worse it is. So I will commit to never revealing the bounty hunter's origin, because it's my small protest that if you're going to have a character who's edgy and mysterious, you can't then tell everyone their whole life story and keep taking their helmet off and showing their giant white veneers. You can't do it. So we're never going to tell you what the bounty hunter's past is. In fact, I wrote a voice line for Wayne when you recruit him that says he has no past, because I was furious at Book of Boba Fett. And that solidified my thinking, because they ruined my favorite character growing up. They ruined him. And I just won't stand for it. I won't stand for it, Glenn. I won't do it.
I see Slave One in the background there, I think, right? And you're
there it is.
The Boba Fett ship.
Yeah.
And I should have known they were going to ruin him, because they already kind of ruined him by making it like Jango Fett's kid, and Jango Fett is just. So I was like, I knew which way the winds were blowing. But
that's funny.
Yeah. Anyway, that's his whole thing is not revealing anything. So like that's the space he occupies. I don't want to change that. Every hero has like, I think I'm very happy with our cast. Like they all have like a bit of a different thing, and some of them are kind of like objectively worse than others, right? Like, the Antiquarian's origin story is like displays her greed and sociopathy, whereas the Lepers is traumatic but not it shows him to be a man of principle, and then the rest of them are kind of in between, and I really like that they each have kind of their own little hook. Sorry for getting worked up about Boba Fett.
I get it. Was it difficult to write like more sincere emotional material inside like such a grim, heightened world?
No, it was very natural. Like I just, they're just people. That's like the thing we try to do. Like Tyler, from a mechanical and game design perspective, and then me on the softer side, like, or the artsy fartsy side, we're trying to reinforce to players that like Darkest Dungeon is about people like you and me trying to make things work, and because ultimately those are the only kind of people there are. Like, I understand the need for like really aspirational kind of power fantasy stuff, but that's not the space that we trade in. So the idea that no one's coming to help you except for your closest friends who are just as screwed up and weird and quirky as you, I think is a really cool thing, and it was very compatible with the general air of cosmic apocalypse and emotional duress and failing relationships and meltdowns and all that to try and imagine these guys having a hard time.
Yeah. You mentioned Wayne June a moment ago. I'd like to talk more about him, if that's okay. His voice is obviously such a huge part of the identity of both Darkest Dungeon games. And with his passing not that long ago, I imagine it might be a bit difficult to talk about it. But I'm curious what you remember most about working with him.
I feel like I've been talking a lot.
It's okay. I mean, you're Chris. You dealt with Wayne the most. I dealt with him some, but so I mean, it's appropriate.
I guess he was just he was so grateful to be part of the thing we were making and really loved doing it. And that's like, there's no better collaborator than that. We look at this at hiring through the same lens. I'd rather have someone who's 75% is good but 200% as invested than someone who's a little bit better but is a bit of a bounty hunter, as it were. And so Wayne just wanted to do a great job. We would send him retakes. He would read every line multiple times. He would re-record the stuff that wasn't quite working. We spent a lot of time, Jeff from Power Up Audio and I, on calls with him early days on DD2 to try to really figure out between the three of us what was going to be different from DD1. We didn't want him to change his voice or do an accent or anything like that. But we knew we needed a slightly different tone, because we knew from day zero that the narrator in DD2 was a good man, and we're not going to pull a twist on you and reveal he was a bad guy. That's DD1's whole thing. So, he just really loved it, and he was always very grateful and would always thank us to an embarrassing degree, and he was very humble, and he spoke very highly of us and the game whenever he was interviewed, and I know he was being authentic because he would say the same things to me, and I felt the same way about working with him. So it was just a great collaboration that came up randomly because I'd heard some audiobooks, and then Tyler was like, why don't you just fucking email him for a trailer, and it's just so weird to have like a 10-year story written out of that kind of like really quick exchange. So the whole thing was really
it was a happy accident.
Yeah.
But born on, I mean, he was such a professional and also an interesting guy. Just like, I think music was probably his bigger thing. I got the feeling, I know he'd done music for a long time, and he had this, such an incredible distinctive voice. But it was also, interesting. Like we never got a chance to meet him in person. There was a time where we offered to fly him out for the wrap party of DD1, and he politely passed and, passed on that opportunity, I should say. And, just like, but he was, I think Darkest Dungeon was a really unexpected success in his life too, in the same way it was for us, that it suddenly became this big thing. And for it to start from just hey, read a few lines for a trailer because we need narration for a trailer because that's what happens in trailers, to like, wait a second, let's write him into the game and structure the game story around this character. There was a number of things on DD1 that kind of worked that way, where like when you start putting something together and then make yourself open and available, and then you see there's other people out there, and you kind of get these like accidental, because the same thing happened, a very accidental meeting with our composer Stuart Chatwood, which we can talk about too. But we were so lucky, and even our sound, kind of the whole sound crew actually was almost
it was
accident,
all luck.
Yeah, all luck. And that was something, I guess we didn't say it earlier, but when you were saying what was sacred going to DD2, our whole sound team, the actual sound, power up audio, Wayne narration, and Stuart for the music, were like, this is staying. Like, this is absolutely, this is a great team that we got to keep together. And I think
we even said that when we did the thing, when we sold the company to Behavior, we're like, this doesn't change. Like the audio team, all that has to remain.
Yeah. We need to work with these same people. And so it's interesting. Like, Wayne has become, his work has become such an important part of Chris and I's life with this game. And so, him passing, it was very kind of unexpected. Both of us had exchanged a couple of emails to him, even while he was in the hospital. And you just never really think, because it wasn't like he went in for a thing that's like, hey, this is the end,
No, and he sent a picture of himself, like a selfie with all these tubes hooked up, and he's like, thumbs up, like, isn't this crazy? And I'm like, okay, I hope you get well soon. Like I had no idea that it was actually as severe as it was, and because he had a good sense of humor. He recorded like singing Africa, like a couple lines of Africa for us, like just as a joke, and so he had a good sense of humor, and that was partly why it was kind of a bit of a shock for sure.
And so it was hard hit, and it's hard to process. And, we've been lucky enough to have a little contact with his widow. And, it was interesting even just to hear kind of her express how much this meant to Wayne. Because, he was not a very necessarily effusive guy, like he's, but kind of like his voice, every word you heard from him was impactful.
I felt like, I was pretty sad because, it was like I learned how to write knowing how he was going to read it. It had been like a decade, right? So I could sit down and bang out tons of text, and I was reading it to myself in his voice in my head, and then he would deliver it, and it was like 90%. I knew which words he'd hit, so I knew which words to use when I wanted him to hit the word. You know what I mean? It was like a really good, and it was also like how I spoke to, or how the game speaks to the players directly, right? It was through Wayne, and so after he died, it's kind of like, okay, like I felt like a little bit, I don't want to overstate it or sound like cheesy, but a little bit of like a tool or a limb or a thing that I relied on is like now gone. And that absence was like, I think felt very acutely, even though we were not in the middle of like, developing a big DLC and we're on the hook for work that we'd never get. And it was a big problem that way. It was more just like, I miss being able to just like sit down, express what I feel like needs to happen, and then know with absolute certainty and confidence that it's going to come back awesome. Those types of collaborations are very rare.
Do you have a favorite like line reading or moment where he surprised you?
No, I can't.
Too many.
I think that my favorite Wayne memory though is like, there's like a suburb of Vancouver called Richmond, which is like just kind of like, I don't know, apologies if anybody lives in Richmond. It's below the water line. It shouldn't be there, but it's all these towers. And this is where Jeff lived, our main audio guy at Power Up. And we had met them and we're going to put together the trailer for DD1. There was no game, but our plan between Tyler and I was, look, if no one cares about the trailer, we shouldn't even make the game, right? So it was a bit of like a litmus test to see, because, we're not as old as we are now, but like, early to mid 30s. They didn't
Late
want to
30s
take a
for me.
Sure. Didn't want to take a flyer on something that had no future, right? So we're like, oh, well, we'll test the waters with this. And I had like storyboarded it and drew it and everything. And we got the edit together from the motion graphics guy. And we were going to put the audio mix together at Jeff's apartment in Richmond. And he had this big audio setup looking out over like he was like, I don't know, 15 stories up, looking out over the rest of the town there, the city. And when we put Stuart's music in with Wayne's narration, we were all just like, holy fuck. And I think I turned to Tyler, or Tyler turned to me. I can't remember. It was like, well, he has to be in the game now. Like, that's the end of it. And so the whole narrator came from how powerful his voice was in that first trailer. Because I didn't want to do flying text on our trailer because that to me wasn't the tone of the game. So I'm like, well, we need someone to sort of talk. But I had not thought about it as being a game feature until that moment. And it was like, okay, this is the whole thing. Like, it has to be there. Yeah. It's undeniable. And that was really like amazing. And that was just his performance. He just threw himself into it for $500. Like, you know, just a random email from a random guy for $500. He read this thing and kicked its ass so hard that we paid him for the next decade. Like, you know, it was amazing.
Was he like immediately on board? Because that's like a longer term commitment when you ask him, like, can you be the narrator for the entire game?
He couldn't wait.
Okay, cool.
But also I think it's like, you don't know, you know, it's another job, you know. I don't kid ourselves to think like he's like, oh, how exciting, you know. I mean, he probably was like, cool, but you know, it's also like, hey, will you narrate this indie game that we have no idea if it'll ever sell more than 20 copies, you know? So I think though that was probably a journey for him too, to do all that work for the work's sake, and then be like, wow, this game is like getting a lot of attention. You know, I think similar with Stuart, like he had done a bunch of high profile things before, but he was into the subject matter of this game. And so I think the same journey of like, then when the game actually was successful, I think it was probably a nice unexpected surprise for both Stuart and Wayne. Because let's face it, a lot of games, they never escape to orbit, you know.
But they both the Power Up guys had immediate confidence. Wayne threw himself into it. Stuart had like immediate confidence. Like, we were really blessed by people who saw what we were trying to do before, like when it was like a bunch of screen mock-ups on an iPad, and they're like, that's awesome, I'm all in. And not only is that like great because you're like, great, we have like audio now, but it's also like emboldening. You're like, oh, someone else believes in this. That's cool.
How do you think about preserving its legacy in the series going forward?
Well, we're not going to use AI to make his voice.
Yeah, I read that article from a while ago, and that's kind of why I'm asking, like, how you're thinking about that.
He made 2 great games. He delivered 2 fantastic performances, and I think the scarcity elevates the work. You know, the fact that there aren't limitless Wayne June narrated games out there makes ours even more special. So, and it's a performance. It's a human being emoting and responding and interpreting, you know, words written by another human being. I think that's like vital. So I think the best thing we can do to honor his legacy is to leave it alone. Yeah. He built his legacy, you know, like he's done an incredible job, and we should just not fuck with it. I would love to, you know, I can't talk about what I can't talk about, but I'd love to include nods and you know, reverent appreciation for Wayne, either by, you know, call outs to the characters he played, or by including some of those lines in future projects in ways that make, you know, sense. Because I think like he should be remembered in the franchise. Like, you know, if there were to be subsequent DD games, I would expect each one of them, like the same way every Marvel movie is like, oh, Stan Lee. You like just an acknowledgement that he was an important part of it is, I think, what we can do.
Yeah. Let's talk about early access, if that's okay. We already talked about it before, but I'm wondering like how you separated useful criticism from like comments like "I want a different game" criticism, because yeah, as we talked about in the beginning, there was a divide in the player base. And so I imagine there were just a lot of comments, "I want a different game," but then there must have also been comments like "very useful." So I just wonder how you made that separation, how you looked at the feedback.
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the way you kind of put it there, if someone wants a different game, it's really easy to ignore that. Not because you don't care or feel bad that maybe you've lost a player of the game, but look, not every game is for every person. There's lots of games. I mean, gosh, the amount of games hitting, but sometimes all my friends will be into a game and it'll just not be a game I'm into, and that's okay. I think one thing kind of lost in some of the discussions and sort of the current state of the game industry is like, it's okay to not like a game and move on and go play something you enjoy. So obviously, yeah, there's nothing you can do if someone's like, I don't want it a run-based roguelike, you're like, oh, that sucks, but so you can kind of throw those away because they're not actionable. There's nothing you can do. But there's tons of useful stuff when people are engaging with the game. And either sometimes it's presented in ways that is really useful. Someone says, hey, I kind of feel like this move is a little weird. I don't know I'd use it. And then, of course, sometimes people say, this character sucks. What a joke. They don't even know what they're doing. That's also still useful, right? But it's helpful when you can get it presented to you in a way that is that you can pull it apart. So the things that we do. So first of all, I'd say this was true for DD1 and DD2, is ultimately Chris and I always try to remember what game we're trying to make. Because as a game developer, game designer, you're always going to get feedback. And sometimes that feedback is it's a different version of that thing we just said of someone saying, I don't like that game. It's like a little more nuanced, but you realize, oh, no. Like if someone said, I don't like all the randomness in DD. It's like, well, there's going to be randomness in DD, and that's important to us. We talked about why with poker or whatever. Yeah. So we always try to remember what we're trying to do. But within that, if someone gives feedback for something that is totally up for potential change, then we try to consider it. The ways in which we've collected the feedback has increased dramatically from DD1. We have our own Discord, which I encourage people to join if they haven't already. We regularly do play tests where we do these like private groups where we give people access. We put them in a Discord channel and we let them play and comment, and we do our best to not sort of we'll ask questions, but we don't if it's a whole bitch session, we let them go, because that's what we're trying to figure out is and a lot of times the most intense discussions are because they do care, they really do care. They want it to be fun. They feel like this is a problem and it makes them mad because if only this was fixed. And so there's been so much useful feedback. So we'll run, sometimes we'll run 4 of those different groups at the same time. So let's say we're putting out a new, piece of content. We'll set up 4 groups and have those people just hammering on it. And, some of the people are longtime community members that have played hundreds of hours of the game. And then sometimes we try to get people in that are newer, because you don't want to only get feedback from people that have 500 hours plus. You also want to understand what it's like to someone new. But I think we were just fully committed to that experience, especially in DD2, because, we had the experience of DD1. And so we put more things in place. Like when DD1 launched into early access, we didn't even have a community manager. It was just Chris and I.
It was another job we did.
Yeah.
We were splitting it. It was like, you do Twitter and you do Facebook. And we're like, okay.
Exactly. And so, by the time DD2 rolled around, we had we had a lot more stuff in place. I mean, our producer now, he originally came on to help with community on DD1. Now he's our producer. Since then, we hired Michaela Pantalini, who's our communications director. So we have a lot more systems in place. And now our playtests run so well between John coordinating and Michaela doing the community side, and then, our QA and everyone else, like that's something I'm really proud of, that we built, that we've not only built the ability to do it, but we've embraced it fundamental to our development. So we try to collect feedback, but ultimately there's always so many choices that you have to make that are kind of a creative choice. And there's plenty of times that Chris and I will look at feedback and say, well, like a common piece of feedback, the bounty hunter should be fully playable. And we're like, we don't want to do it for the reasons that we believe in. We know it makes some people mad, but there's an example where like, we don't just do it because there's feedback on it. We'll change based on feedback if we feel like it's ultimately in service of the game that we're trying to make, and that's
that's an interesting example though too. If I just wanted to jump on that, like the
go
bounty hunter thing, many bounty hunter fans were disappointed that he wasn't fully playable, but the role that he fills in this particular game, not forever, is being like an overpowered character that you can use very briefly to kind of like salvage maybe a run that's starting to tip over. So the feedback we're interested in is not whether or not he should be fully playable, but is his value felt? Is he powerful enough to feel like he's a rocket launcher, like he's a run changer? Yeah. I want to hear all about that. If people are unhappy with his skill loadout, they're unhappy with his damage output, his compatibility with other heroes, all of that is fascinating and absolutely on point, and we're totally open and receptive to that. Existentially, we're not going to get knocked off the position we have that we need a character who overperforms for a short amount of time. That's a really interesting mechanic, especially in a roguelike. So it's kind of an interesting example that you hit on, Tyler, just like worth explaining. I feel like just how we think about the feedback. Like we want a lot of it, but there are going to be times where we're like, well, no, this is kind of fundamentally what we're doing.
Yeah.
The game is complex enough that we rely on the community a lot. And, and so we've tried to really incorporate that into our process, like I said, because look, with a dozen plus heroes, each with 11 skills plus 3 paths on addition to their non-path, it's actually like, our combat designer or our hero combat designer, James, really experienced designer. And he pointed out to me a while back that like messing with a new DD2 hero is basically like 40 or 50 skills. It's not 11 skills, because with the way that we do stuff with paths where we kind of dramatically change stuff. And so all that is to say that, we're not a giant company where we have big groups of internal playtest teams and massive QA. Like our QA was like 1-2 people. Now it's, I think, 1 person, I forget. But we need the community, because they're the ones that, they know aspects of the game better than we do, but we know what we're trying to deliver. And so, it's great. Chris and I have been early access fans since the beginning, and the reason is it's a pretty cool thing to be able to like get involved in a game's development from a player standpoint. If you're into that sort of thing, obviously some people are like, hey, when it's done, let me know. And that's totally good too. But from a developer standpoint, it's really neat. It's hard. And I think one thing about early access that is the hardest is people really don't like change. And so it's kind of a bummer, because the purpose of early access is to be able to kind of like, iterate, ideally just polish, but sometimes you got to change things. And it's really hard to change things once the game is out. So I think there is still a purpose for private playtest before early access. I think in any new game that we should create, we'll probably try to employ some of that, because once you're out and once you're selling copies,
and once YouTubers are talking about it and there's a collective agreement on what the game is, positive or negative, it's kind of done. It's kind of locked in. It doesn't really matter what you change. If everybody sort of starts talking on YouTube or Twitch about balance is terrible, it's like a political message. Like it spreads and is internalized by the player base at large. And then it kind of doesn't, it's really hard to change that narrative once it's kind of settled in.
Yeah, I have an anecdote on that specifically. When we released DD2 into early access, so, there's the relationship system, which is kind of the version of the stress system in the second game. Your heroes develop affinity with each other, and then that kind of indirectly causes them to form positive or negative relationships. But anyway, so we had all these different kind of triggers that can cause plus or minus affinity. And in the build that came out, on early access launch, one of the events where it was a kill stealing one, I think, where let's say Highwayman's done a bunch of damage to an enemy, and then the Grave Robber comes in and finishes the enemy off. The Highwayman can sometimes go, "Hey, that was mine," And it's funny because I played tons of D&D games growing up, and that was real behavior. Like people would be like, "No, that." And if you played, I don't know, original Diablo, everyone's trying to jump on the treasure first. Like there are competitive behaviors even amongst allies. And anyway, so it was meant to be a flavor thing that happened occasionally. There was an error in our data, and it was happening all the time, or very, very frequently. And so one of the things right away, people got really mad about the relationship system because there was a couple of these annoying kind of semi-illogical triggers that were happening all the time. And I realized, oh crap, too late, maybe 2 days later or something, that it was a data error. And there's an example where boy, I wish we had done more private group testing before early access, because that shaped some of the sentiment. It wasn't itself only responsible, but it definitely shaped some of the initial responses people had to the relationship system. And we had a hell of a time. I tuned it out, it got better. And of course we did other changes too. But we struggled for a while to kick the narrative that the relationship system was just fundamentally flawed. And so, yeah, that stuff is hard. And the other thing that happened is, for example, now some outlets will actually give a ranked, a number score for your early access game. And that had not happened to us on DD1. All the early access press was generally hey, this is kind of what the game is. It's pretty fun so far. This seems a little rough. We'll see where it goes. And then we came out into early access, and I think it was IGN or something had adopted a new kind of approach of scoring your early access build. And that was a bit of a shock for us because, look, it's not like we thought we were releasing something terrible, but we knew it's early access. So, hey, buy it if you want in at this rough stage. If you want to wait till it's done, wait till you're done. So I think some things have changed now, like Chris is saying, where, it's hard, you crystallize the impression of your game at that point, even though it's not done.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing too, when combined with kind of, I think the general gaming communities have a somewhat more matured understanding of what goes into making a game. But I still think that there's a lot of ill-informed opinions about how much work it actually is. So when you have heightened expectations around early access, you have a kind of crystallizing opinions that happen faster and faster nowadays because there's so many more people talking, online.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the realities of game development where you can't just pivot on a dime, no matter what, whatever Reddit user might claim. You're not able to respond quickly enough to kind of avoid some of these crystallizing impressions. The hero paths for us are a great example. We have something 13, 14 heroes in Darkest Dungeon 2. They all have these 3 paths. Like Tyler said, it's about 80 skills essentially per hero. They all have to be balanced. They all have to be changed. Last year we did a big pass where we're going to, update the paths on the remaining heroes and do a hero balance pass. So the effort that went into that was, I don't think, understood by the community at large. We ran our testing pools. We had a community manager and producer running the Discord groups. We have 4 cohorts of testers with about 10 to 20 people in each one. We have the combat designer who's deep in these gigantic spreadsheets, changing numbers, moving things around. And even if we only allowed 1 week per path per hero, and there were 4 heroes left, I could be wrong on the number there, but 4 heroes times 4 paths, that's over 2 months of work right there. And people are like, well, why isn't it done? Why shouldn't it should just be finished? We're tired of waiting for it. And I understand the impatience comes from a desire to play the game, which I love. But we also want to do the work. We also need time to do the work and do it well. And when you just add up, I've experienced a drop in my stomach when I realize how much time it's going to take us to do whatever work is in front of us. I'd love to snap my fingers and get it done faster, but it's just not the way it works.
Yeah. During early access, or maybe even before you entered early access, were there ideas that made it far into development but ultimately had to be cut or reworked? Because I ask it because I'm always super interested in that part of game development and game design. Like, what made it really far but still had to be cut, and what did the game look like before that?
Yeah.
Camping on DD2. We cut.
Yeah, we definitely made some real key cuts. I don't know that anything made it super far. Like, one thing we have done usually pretty well is cut things early. And I remember us like high-fiving after some cuts, because it's kind of a freeing experience. Like, so you come up with an idea. Yeah. So like, we wanted to do camping in DD2 because, it was such a cool part of DD1. I'm really proud of that tactical camping system. I still think it was a real neat addition. And so we were trying to, but then we realized like it was kind of hard to differentiate between that and the inn. And we're like, is camping really just a subset of what you're going to do at the inn? And you're going to be doing that again 15 minutes later. And, and so we're like, oh, even though camping is something we're proud of in DD, we got to cut it. And it's so relieving to cut something and realize like the game doesn't need it. Another thing that this didn't get cut exactly, but versions of it got cut. So the way that we call them stories, but like when let's say you arrive and there's the people like the peasants, like help, and you have some options for what you do. Like someone's like, let's give them food. And someone's like, let's rob them. We struggled with that system for a long time, trying to make it a really big, like much more blown out system with like all these possibilities. We called it stories. And then we just kept not getting where we needed to go with it. And we eventually realized that it should just be pared down to these kind of tactical, if you abstract it, they're kind of like tactical choices. If I make this choice, I get this resource, sacrifice this resource. If I do this, whatever. That one, we spent a fair amount of time going down some rabbit holes that didn't end up panning out. And when we eventually simplified it back to what it was, it was hard because we had this vision of all these things it could be, but letting that go, I think, was really important. That's my memory of that, at least.
No, that's a good one, actually. I kind of gloss over that in my memory. But yeah, we had a dedicated designer and an engineer for quite some time working on because we thought, okay, this is a chance to get a little bit more RPG with it, right? Like a little bit more kind of immersive. But yeah, ultimately, it was actually at odds with the roguelike thing. It's like, you don't want to stop and hear about someone's woes while you're on like a cosmic existential quest for the future of humanity. You don't want to hear about collect me 10 wolf pelts. Like, who gives a shit? Like, collect them yourself. I'm busy. So it worked out better, but it took us a little while to get there for sure.
Yeah. Is there anything else we cut? I'm trying to remember. I feel like DD2 was more about iterating on systems rather than cutting things. With the exception of the things we mentioned there.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's more like, we went through revisions, like even the relationships and even the driving, like we kept kind of iterating and adding things. And, we were lucky that the art direction, the art direction stuff he talked about, and then the combat redo that I talked about were happening at the same time at the very beginning of the project. And that really set us up, because there was a point, like we were about a year into trying to make the token system. And the problem wasn't the token system. It was that we switched technology. We went from a 2D engine to Unity. And it took us longer to rebuild combat in DD2 than it took us to create combat in the first place. And not because anyone wasn't working hard. It's just like, So yeah, it's funny. Like DD1 went from the day that we figured out how we were going to structure combat, we probably had something up and running in a month.
But DD1's engine was like a dune buggy of just like, it can only do this one thing. Whereas like Unity is like a 3D, it wants to make a platformer, or, and Unreal wants to make a shooter. So we're like, okay, I hear you on this platforming thing, but what if there were no platforms and these 3D models behaved like they were 2D, and Unity had had a hard time
meltdown.
with that. Unity also had a hard time with edge tracing and fog and all of these important art features that I don't want to speak poorly of Unity.
I mean, part of it was we chose a rendering path that ended up stopping being supported. So there was some just like unlucky bounces there that, maybe other projects didn't have to deal with. But
that was our darkest dungeon.
Why was I going on that story? Oh, I think I was going on the story just to be like, there were some things that if they didn't end up working out, we would have been in trouble, but nothing really made it too far and then got cut. I think we were able to get stuff cut somewhat early.
Okay, cool. Before we round up the podcast, the last thing that I want to talk about is the release of Darkest Dungeon 2 when it came out of early access. What did launch day for Darkest Dungeon 2 feel like compared to the first game?
That's a really good question, man. Nicely done on that. DD1 or like early access launch more so than Well, I'll do them all really quick. DD1 early access launch was like pure unbridled adrenaline, exuberance, and disbelief that we had immediately started selling so many copies as we did, that people liked it, that it was actually working. Like it's happening right before your eyes. Unparalleled feeling that I will probably never experience again in my life.
We're never going to have that same.
I'm so grateful that I have like this like little nugget of a memory of that left inside me somewhere. DD2 or DD1 full release was like kind of a solid, we did it. We'd weathered a few community storms. The game continued to perform well. It didn't surge the same way that early access did, but it was still very, very good release. And it kind of cemented our review scores.
That's true.
And so we felt like bullish and it was like, fuck yeah, we did it. DD2 early access launch was, this is just the start of a very long and difficult road. And there were a lot of people who were like singing the praises of like the art, and they're like happy that we're making new stuff. But then it didn't take long for this sort of like comparison criticism loop to kick in. And we're like, okay, this is a different feeling altogether. This is not like we're on a rocket ship. It's like we have a half-built rocket ship and we have a limited time to fix it. DD2, for me, the launch was this weird mix of like pride, satisfaction, and relief, and just exhaustion. All the team was like watching streamers like Admiral Baru playing it, and he had a whole bunch of people watching, and he beat the game, and he was like just singing the praises of the climax, and that was so awesome and validating. But I remember watching the team like they're having drinks and stuff, and my feeling was just I'm kind of spent. And then we started talking about DLC.
Right.
Yeah. I think the one piece I'll add is the DD2 early access launch was on the Epic Game Store only.
That's true.
So we also had to deal with some fallout from that because, and honestly, when we signed the deal with Epic, it was several years before that release. It was still very early on in development. It was a really good financial decision for us, which is, people may not want to hear, but there's a reality. Like DD2 took, I don't know, it was like $15 million or something to make. I forget exactly. It depends on what you count through full release and then DLCs, but it's somewhere between, I don't know, call it 15 to 20 million probably. And it is profitable for all you haters out there. Just FYI.
My God, don't say that.
No, I'm sorry. Because we get attacked a lot because it hasn't sold as much as DD1. But anyway, what I was going to say is when we made that decision with Epic, we thought the chief risk was pissing off Valve, pissing off Steam. But we're like, basically the deal with Epic was enough that we already knew that we weren't going to lose money on the game. So that was important.
And we can make a better game. We hired more people and spent more time making DD2 because of the Epic deal, which is in service of the people who played it on Steam. So we felt like we're doing right by even people who don't like the Epic Game Store. We're making them a better product,
Yeah, and but what we didn't know, and maybe this is another thing where like kind of when you ask the question of like, essentially, did you know by making a sequel that's different that you'd anger a lot of people? I also don't think we thought we were going to anger people. Like when Epic was positioning itself, it's like, hey, it's some other storefront competition to Steam. Generally, people don't like, only having one option. Epic, has a different cut for developers, whatever. Anyway, all this is to say, though, that we just didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. Then in the intervening time between when we signed that and then we released, a fair amount of community backlash generated for the Epic Store. And I'm not here to comment on whether I think that makes any sense or not. But I will say that, we got, like many games, got caught in the sort of blast of that where you like, some people are just mad that it was out on Epic. It was almost helpful for us that like it was a smaller player pool, rather than kind of like having quite as many people. But it was an additional community challenge. So there was kind of a bummer to that too, where, you've spent years working on a game and you finally put it out there on the shelf and you're hopeful that people will, and then people are just mad that you're selling it there, and it's like, and we, we're lucky we have a great relationship with Valve. Steam has been absolutely critical to our whole existence, and we love, and it was great because when we told them about that, they're like, well, yeah, I see why you do that. We hope you'll bring the game to us when it's out. And we did. That was always the plan. And so anyway, yeah, the early access launch on DD2 was a little different than DD1. But like Chris, I think like shipping DD2 1.0, there was definitely some intense pride on all the things that we saw that we had improved. But it actually had a better, it sold more copies, earned more money than DD1 did on its launch day, or even early access launch day. So the initial burst was great, and that was good. But then I think like, it doesn't move the same number of units that DD1 does. That's no surprise to anyone, I don't think, in terms of, the data's out there. But we've tried really hard to keep working on it. It's still been a successful game. Like I said, I think it's like, it's weird when you make games, it's kind of like being a musician, I guess. You release a new album and sometimes it outsells the previous album and sometimes it doesn't. But you don't want that to get in your head and be like, oh, well, why make music? Like, oh, okay, well, our first album was so good. Why even make music anymore? No, we like making music, and we're going to keep making music. So,
yeah. What did Darkest Dungeon 2 teach you that Darkest Dungeon 1 never could have?
I don't know, these questions. Just going for it. Just digging right in the ribs, like rooting around.
Because I feel like with Darkest Dungeon 2, like you went through like a longer process, more involved even with the community. There was more criticism during that process. So it sounded like it was a much different experience from the first game. So I'm wondering, like, what did that teach you that the first game never could have taught you?
I think, like, for me, maybe it was a rougher, like, time at sea, right? Like, making 2 over 1 for all the reasons that we've talked about. But I think what I took from that was our process of steering towards our kind of like creative vision was ultimately correct and really the only way that I know how or would want to develop. Because in the end, despite the fact that there were some stormy seas, there were some, beautiful days too. In the end, we got to a point where, the game got to where it wanted to go, regardless of, the sales or whatever being what they are, which again are totally good. But the game came into its own. We got to know it, and it became ultimately what we had set out to make. And I think that's what you can control as a developer. You can't kind of control the market into which you launch a game. You can't control, if a huge game is going to scoop your release window. You can't control if player expectation doesn't match what you've put out. Like you can't control so much of the business and the timing of video game creation and release. So I guess 2 taught me that to focus and really believe in and cling to the things that we can control, what we cut, what we keep, how we build our team, how we make the team feel over the course of development. A lot of times, in these talks, like we discuss a lot about the game and we discuss a lot about the impressions of the game, and it's all about the game, which is important, but it's oftentimes very easy to forget that it's made by a group of people. Those people need to feel good about the work they do. They need to feel like it matters. They need to feel like they're contributing in meaningful ways. And if it's miserable to start a game and take it all the way to launch, that team will fracture. People will quit. It's not a great place to work. And so, making sure that people felt like we were steering ourselves in a consistent direction towards a release that we could quantify, towards a vision that hadn't changed, and then validating their efforts and their contributions along the way. I felt like 2 really showed that you can get through some stormy waters if you do that. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. Like what was occurring to me is just kind of a lot of stuff we've talked about today. I think shows some of the things that I realize that we've sort of hammered on a lot of things about like where DD2 departed or where it surprised people or whatever. But ultimately, I'm proud of what we built. I had an experience recently, actually. It was about 2 months ago, or a month and a half ago. I sat down and played DD2 for real, like just to play it. It'd been so long since I had booted it for any reason other than to check something or look at something or remind myself about something. I said, you know what? I just want to with a fresh brain. And there were a million things I picked up right away that I'm like, oh, I wish we had tweaked that or done this, or this is a little confusing. But it was fun and it was an interesting game. And I'm proud of what we built. And I think maybe one thing that is, you can't live or die. This is tougher to put into practice but philosophically, a thing DD2 has tried to reinforce in me and maybe even Chris too is like, man, you can't live or die by your press clippings. Like, DD1 was a really, for the most part, almost always positive ride, except for some issues we had with corpses and whatever else that people can read about. And DD2 was, a little more of a battleground. And if you're not careful, it gets in your head, and it'll affect your design process and it'll affect your outlook and it'll affect all these things. And, the lesson I want to take from it is like, just because you didn't please everybody doesn't mean there wasn't something of value, and our whole ethos as creators, going back to DD1, is we want to take risks. We want to do things that are unusual. We want to, because we feel like we can't create something really noteworthy without taking some of those risks. But, just like poker, when you make the bet, you could lose money or you could, it doesn't always work out in your favor, but I'm proud of what we built. Yeah.
Cool. I have one more question, but it might open up a whole other can of worms. And we've been going for over 2 hours, so feel free to let me know if you have to go. But the Kingdoms expansion came after the full release. And I'm wondering how that came about. Was that maybe a direct response to some of the criticism, or was that in place like before you even entered early access? Was that an idea you had even before early access?
No, it was, could we get excited about remixing our own album? That's the fundamental sort of premise of Kingdoms. What if we, it's a remix album. And, it sort of seeks to like I guess like when you say it's responding to criticisms, it looks like we're scrambling and trying to serve up just anything we think people will eat, and we don't operate that way. We were not blind to the fact that many in our player base hearkened for more like of a longer term campaign, a la DD1. Some of that persistent kind of like growth over a campaign, getting to know their heroes, having death be more consequential. We'd read all that, and we thought, okay, well, is there kind of a cool way we could take what we have and rebuild it into something that would create an experience like that? Like, is that something that we think could be fun to make? And that's where Kingdoms kind of came from. Okay, well, what if the kingdom is persistent? You still drive around, but there's a map and there's the inns, and now you can upgrade inns. And, it began as sort of a thought experiment, and then kind of became like, this could be really exciting and fun to do, and kind of more interesting than, look, like I'm a character designer. I love all the heroes, but like definitely a more exciting proposition from a risk standpoint than making a DLC with another playable hero. We had done that, and we'd done a great job of it, and we introduced some really cool stuff in the Crusader DLC, like a little bit of a mini quest chain. So that technology, I say in quotes, but that like innovation in Darkest Dungeon 2 with the Crusader quest chain was also something that informed our enthusiasm for Kingdoms. What if you had a big long quest chain you could do? And both Tyler and I are older and remember original D&D modules, and we got really inspired by like, we could have like these adventure packs basically. So it started from kind of a mix of all of those things. Yes, we know there's DD1 lovers out there. Can we serve them in DD2? But if we couldn't imagine a way of doing that in a way that we thought was cool or fun, we wouldn't have done it. And the team internally really rallied around the Kingdoms idea, and end to end, it was like a year and maybe.
Yeah, we did it really fast, and I think you're right about how it started as a thought experiment, and then we got excited, and that's kind of the fundamentals of how we greenlight anything. Is if he and I start getting excited about it, then that's a really important first. As opposed to going out and trying to do like focus tests or market research, it's like, no, we know the market, we read the things, we know what's out there, and then we're like, wow, actually, if you take all these mechanical parts of DD2, that the fact that you could reassemble them into a different machine sounded kind of fun. And we thought it might bring in some DD1 players who haven't taken the plunge on DD2 and acted a little bit as a way of like introducing the game that they then may go back and play Confessions mode. That's the hope. And then also for people who had already played Confessions mode, like a big difference on DD2 to DD1 is like, DD2 was kind of built in a way that, look, when you finish the 5 bosses, you could call it a day, and we're happy. Like, we're happy if you're happy.
You beat the game.
You beat the game. You played it for 50 hours and you won. Whereas DD1, is kind of like you could almost go forever and you could put thousands of hours. Now, the truth is you can put many hundreds or thousands into DD2, and we did stuff like the vitrine to incentivize you to do all these different challenge runs with different infernal flames, and but we were also fine if you like got your 50 hours and you're like, that was fun. And so Kingdoms also felt like a new thing to give to those people, because it wasn't only a mechanism to perhaps attract some DD1 players. It was also like, hey, if you like DD2, you love the combat, you had fun with the confessions, you did all the hero stories, here's a new way to play. And the big risky thing we did there, which I don't know if I really liked the strategy, but I don't know that it worked, was offering it for free. So our thought was,
we both loved that strategy. We were both enamored. Like we were like, we're just going to give it to people. All three.
And it was a lot of development cost and a lot of money, and and we did it pretty fast, all things considered. But our thought was DD2 was already priced a bit higher than DD1. It's like $40. It was a bigger team. It was more money that went into it, et cetera. There were justifications of why. But I think that we didn't want to be like, hey, let's say you are on the fence and want to try DD2. We didn't want you to have to buy that plus a big, say, $15 DLC of Kingdoms. Yeah. So we said, let's just do it for free. yeah, I don't know that it really. I think it probably would have. It certainly would have made us more money if we just sold it. But the intent and the strategy was to just pack more goodies into the game, and that's always been something we've tried to alternate. Like we'll do some paid DLC, but we've never been shy about putting free stuff in. And this was a big, I guess you could say, gamble, and it was fun to work on. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that you, gave that for free. And I imagine that was also maybe only possible because you don't have a publisher, because I don't think anyone could have convinced a publisher to give out all that content for free.
We probably should have charged, I guess, but I don't know. I feel like it's really, like, I don't want to, this isn't like lip service to the community or anything, but like we've talked a lot about how valuable and, impactful the community is, how much we rely on them for testing, and ultimately we make games for people to play, right? Like that's the whole thing, is to entertain people and challenge them in interesting ways. And so I feel like part of what was happening for Tyler and I was like, it was a bit of a thank you play. Like we value that we have been around for like over a decade making, in Darkest Dungeon. We have people who followed us every step of the way, and we have the opportunity, you're right, without a publisher that would have been a tough sell, to just do something kind of reckless and fiscally irresponsible, in the name of, like, I guess in a way trying to just like humanize the relationship between us as developers and the community as players. Like we're here. We want to give you things that are entertaining and challenging and interesting, and we're happy that you've stuck with us.
But I think though it also, we felt both those things could be true. I thought it would both be a nice thing to do for the community and end up might actually be better for the game. And what I mean by that is usually, like, kind of when you're selling paid DLC, kind of what you're doing is you're just selling to people who already own the game, right? Obviously, some new people come in and buy both the game and the DLC when they hear about it. But it's kind of like selling D&D modules, right? Like there was always kind of like a thing of like, if there's 1 million people who have the player's handbook, you're not going to sell the module to more than 1 million people. You're going to sell to a subset of the people who are playing the game. And so we felt like with what Kingdoms was trying to do, it didn't make sense to be like DLC attach rates usually vary between, I don't know, call it like 10% on the low end and maybe like 40 or 50% on the high end, meaning like for every 100 people that own the game, you're lucky, a really good result would be 30 or 40 buying the DLC. That would be fantastic result. We've been lucky with Darkest Dungeon. Like often our attach rates, like DD1, our attach rates are like over 40%. It's crazy. But anyway, what I was going to say is, we didn't really want to be like, hey, we're going to sell Kingdoms to 30% of the people who own DD2. We were trying to be like, hey, like this is an undeniable value proposition. Not only do you get this entire game, but you get this entire mode. Also play whatever, play both, play one, whatever, have fun. And then, by the way, there's a couple DLC over here that you can buy if you want. So,
DD2 is a huge game right now. Like
it is big,
the 2 DLCs, 3 extra characters, 1 extra region, all 3 Kingdoms things, those 3 factions plus it's a gigantic game.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's a good. Oh yeah, go ahead, Tyler. What do you want to say?
Well, I think that we've said on an interview before that well, we're not out of the dungeon. I think we said.
Yeah, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's a good note to end the podcast on. Cool. Chris and Tyler, it was an absolute delight and honor to talk to you guys. It was so much fun, and I can't wait to share this episode of the podcast with my audience.
Thank you so much for having us on. We really appreciate it. It's always nice to be able to talk at length and try to pull back the curtain on some of this stuff. So thank you for the opportunity.
And the questions were very, very thoughtful. So that always, we've done enough interviews that it's fun for us when there's like thoughtful, insightful questions. And obviously you did a lot of prep on that. So we appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah. Glad to hear that. Thank you everybody for listening, and till the next episode. Goodbye.